You are watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV from Toronto, Ontario. I am Catherine Bullock. Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. Disability and poverty experts are expressing concern over MAID, medical assistance in dying. Later in the show, we will talk to Rabia Khedr, who is the executive director of an organisation called Disability Without Poverty. But first, some news headlines. Keeping First Nations languages alive in the North. Ontario pharmacies to treat 13 illnesses in 2023. Grant funds Indigenous Youth Project. India test fires new version of BrahMos missile. And now the details. The federal government is spending $39.4 million to help sustain First Nations languages in northern Canada. In spite of the residential school system that forbade Indigenous languages, many Indigenous languages are still used daily in the north. There are 9 Indigenous languages in the Northwest Territories that are official. The other 2 are English and French. The Yukon has 8 First Nation languages, though none are official. First Nations Chief Fred Sangris says the funding helps reconciliation. It will allow his group to have Indigenous language resources, camps and classes. Sangris says, quote, "Without language, identity is lost." The Olive Tree Foundation has awarded a grant to an organisation called Ontario Nature for the initiative Youth Circle for Mother Earth. The initiative will unite young Indigenous and non-Indigenous environmental leaders where they can fulfill their relationship and obligations with Mother Earth. The organisation says, quote, "The generosity from Olive Tree Foundation will support the creation of a land-based learning guide, an important resource for planning and hosting future land-based learning events. Ontario Nature was founded in 1931. It is well known for nature leadership in Ontario. The Olive Tree Foundation is a humanitarian initiative that supports community growth through charity and funds. As of January 1st, Ontario pharmacies will be able to evaluate and prescribe medication for 13 common illnesses. And people who show a valid Ontario health card will not have to pay. The Ontario government has been considering this since July this year. Ontario clinics and hospitals have been experiencing a rise in viral ailments. The government hopes the new rule will decrease the emergency room and physicians' wait times. After this, only British Columbia will not have this provision. Alberta was the first province that introduced this measure as long ago as 2007. A pharmacist who served on the advisory committee thinks by 2023, all 10 provinces will allow pharmacists to prescribe medication. India's Defence Ministry says it has successfully fired Thursday the extended range version of BrahMos missile against a ship target from an aircraft. The ministry says in a statement that their mission objectives in the Bay of Bengal region were satisfied. It added that the Indian Air Force has achieved a significant capability boost to carry out precision strikes from aircraft against land and sea targets over very long ranges. Though the statement did not mention the range of the new missile, some local media report the range might be between 350 and 400 kilometres. And that's it for the news. The Quran teaches us that human life is sacred. It prohibits suicide. In Canada, over the last few years, the government has been expanding eligibility to its medically assisted death or MAID law. To talk to us today about how medical assistance in dying intersects with disability rights and anti-poverty advocacy, we are joined now by Rabia Khedr, National Director of an organisation called Disability Without Poverty. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum salam, thank you.
You've been with us before talking about issues related to disability and poverty, and this one seems to be a newly important issue, although it's been around in Canada for a while. How has your organisation, if it has at all, been reacting to these laws about medical assistance in dying?
Well, essentially, we've been advocating for the Canada Disability Benefit, which is Bill C-22, in Parliament right now, which would offer a supplemental benefit to people with disabilities living in poverty across the country. One of the reasons that people with disabilities are choosing medical assistance in dying or MAID is because they feel they have no option to live with dignity. And everybody fundamentally, universally, deserves dignity. So when the conversation is happening around poverty, is happening around assisted dying, we are highlighting this specific message that the government has a job to do. It has an obligation to provide people a supplemental benefit that meets their basic needs to be able to live with dignity.
We saw in the news some very sad stories. One of them was from a veteran who was in a wheelchair. She'd been at the Paralympics, and she was claiming that someone at Veteran Affairs Canada was offering her medical assistance in dying when all she'd call in was asked for help with getting a wheelchair ramp. And she made a comment that really struck me. She said something like, "You're going to help me die, but you're not going to help me live." How does that sentiment intersect with the advocacy you're doing with that bill that you just mentioned?
Well, again, it's that very thing, that there are services, supports that people need. There are basic needs that people have. People with disabilities are finding themselves in poverty because they don't have access to employment. They face all kinds of barriers to reaching their full potential in order to earn adequately to thrive. Mm-hmm. This was true before the pandemic. So people with disabilities lived in poverty. In fact, 41% of people living in poverty are disabled. Mm. And this was true before the pandemic. This got even deeper during the pandemic. And as we're finding ourselves economically struggling with inflation, it got deeper and deeper and deeper now.
So somebody who is having pain from a disability is also in poverty and sees the only solution is to apply for medical assistance in dying. Is that what you're sort of pointing to?
Well, people with invisible disabilities who you wouldn't even recognize as having disabilities, like fibromyalgia, like a woman that I participated with on another interview, Jackie. Jackie lives in poverty, and she told her story. And essentially, she struggles with managing her pain on a daily basis. And because she's struggling financially, she sought out MAID as a potential option. There have been several stories, people being offered it or even considering it. Nobody should have to consider dying as the only way out of poverty in a first world nation.
It seems, in fact, incredible that that's what's happening. And it just brings me back to what that vet had said, you want to help me die, but you don't want to help me live. And yet I sense that the conversations seem to be happening in parallel tracks. There's the whole conversation about medical assistance in dying and, dying with dignity and alleviating pain. And then there's the whole conversations about anti-poverty or helping people with disability live. I don't see a lot of intersection, or am I missing that conversation? And you're very well aware of it.
Well, again, MAID is a privileged option. People with privilege who, have all the means also want to seek out death because their means will not, quote unquote, end any physical hardship that they're facing. So medical assistance in dying is, an option for them to die with dignity. But they're able to meet their basic needs. Lawmakers who have voted for MAID, who have institutionalized this law, are putting forward a privilege. Like Professor Trudeau-Lemons said, it's not like you're giving people with disabilities the dignity to die. The option to die has always been there. People can choose to end their lives. They have that choice. Now we've just put a whole medical framework, a legal framework around it that's really unnecessary. And legally, what we're doing now is expanding the qualifiers, the medical qualifiers for eligibility. So we have considered expanding mental illness as one of those medical needs that people can seek out to remedy through medical assistance in dying. And that to me is a very, very slippery slope. We had an ugly history in this country before World War I and even thereafter around euthanizing people with disabilities, around institutionalizing them, sterilizing them. In fact, our laws that institutionalized and sterilized people with disabilities were studied by the Holocaust master himself, Hitler. So we have this ugly, ugly history of wanting to eradicate people with disabilities from our society. And now we are justifying this through a very privileged piece of legislation where we are giving people the legal right to die, even if they are mentally unstable. In that moment of stability, we're saying, yes, equal rights, you have the right to choose to die. It's very frightening to me. It just reeks of how we are valuing disabled bodies now.
I hope to have time to come back to something that you said, but I just want to throw in a puzzle that I have as well over this whole issue. I heard on the radio yesterday an organization which is making an appeal to stop suicide amongst young people. And then on the other hand, we have this medical assistance in dying. So is our society feels confused or something? Can you sort of speak to that?
Absolutely. It's a contradiction. It's an absolute contradiction. From one end, we're putting all this money, but you know what? We're a country based on contradictions, right? Like we legalize certain street drugs, and then we have drug rehab programs. We are building casinos, and then we have gambling rehab programs to protect people. And now we're doing the same thing with the idea of assisted death. That, on one hand, it's suicide, and we have to have all these prevention programs to help people not choose that as a way out. And yet, but you know what? If you're really in that much pain, if you're really terminal, if you're really struggling with mental illness, et cetera, we're going to give you a way out legally to commit suicide. I think it's just easing our guilty social conscience as a society that prides itself on certain values. Well,
we've got about 30 seconds left. I don't know if this is even possible. Can you just explain a little bit more about what you meant by MAID being a privilege?
Again, people who live with privilege, so people who have the means to thrive, rich people, they cannot deal with their medical needs through their resources. So, here's a good framework for them to die in a classy way. And I'm being harsh, I recognize that. But it's because I really struggle with the fact that we are creating a slippery slope for people with disabilities to have to choose MAID because we're not giving them the programs and services and supports and the financial means to live with basic dignity.
And we're out of time, but obviously the call that you're making is help people live with their basic needs, a basic income or something like that. Thank you for joining us, Rabia, today.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you like what we do, please share, like, and subscribe. Stay safe and God bless.